Je voudrais tout d'abord remercier justement
I would like
Clément
to start by thanking Clément and Alexandra for inviting me to this seminar to talk about degrowth.
parce que la décroissance est un mot en fait.
Degrowth is a scary word for some. It has very negative connotations.
Ça va être l'occasion justement.
So this is an opportunity to show that these connotations are unfounded.
La décroissance a un certain nombre de
There
justifications.
are several ways to justify degrowth from an economic perspective, and for two reasons.
Environ une cinquantaine d'années.
For the past 50 years, more or less, growth has been criticized regarding the calculations that go into it, how it's calculated, but also its consequences on the environment. Think of the Club of Rome from 1972.
Déjà, cela, puisqu'on critique la croissance, on peut penser que.
So, since we criticize growth, we can see the rationale for degrowth.
Qu'il y avait un problème avec la croissance.
Secondly,
beaucoup de gens ont réfléchi.
a lot of people have discussed the problems of growth and come up with the idea of green growth, that this might be the solution. So what is green growth? It means continued economic growth, but at the same time with less disruption of the natural environment. So having your cake and eating it too. The problem is that this combination has limits. First of all, it's relative, and we will talk about that further. And yet, degrowth remains somewhat hidden, nebulous.
Et donc, finalement, actuellement, on a beaucoup de mal.
And today, it's hard to explain what degrowth actually means. I'm going to try to show the consequences by talking about a current event. Right now, we're facing a health crisis with all of the restrictions and constraints that come with it. People accept these restrictions and constraints because they recognize the risks. When it comes to the environment, however, things are very different. We see glaciers melting. We say, well, it's severe, it's a big problem, but we do not change our habits. Implicitly, we tend to assume that the ecological crisis might happen later, but it's not current. Now, if the government reacted the same way to the ecological crisis as to the health crisis, we would have actual dialogue and we would have much stronger measures. Now, however, a dialogue presupposes information, and accounting provides this information. So we can talk about accounting at the service of degrowth. Now, to start on this point, I'd like to start by talking about degrowth in general, because as I just mentioned, it remains nebulous for a lot of us.
Voilà. Donc, première partie, je vais parler de la décroissance.
So I'll start by talking about degrowth, and in the second part, we will move on to accounting.
Tout d'abord, la décroissance, il faut bien voir que c'est pas quelque chose donc qui est.
First of all, degrowth is nothing new. From an economic perspective, we live with degrowth on a daily basis.
C'est considéré comme une espèce de maladie.
Today, it's seen as a sort of illness that needs to be addressed and cured.
On a des petites maladies, et puis on les soigne, et puis on continue sa vie. Alors pourquoi
Now, why do I say that? Simply because when we look closely, we see,
if
we take a macroeconomic perspective,
dans les
we see degrowth in the context of economic cycles
descendantes des cycles économiques et qui peuvent aboutir à des récessions.
can lead to recessions, and a recession is, in the end, an instance of degrowth. Progress in economic research and political experience
En général, on évite.
Means that we rarely have true recessions and real degrowth. We know how to cure this degrowth. Now, how do we cure it? With appropriate economic policies, also tax policies, budget deficits, and
soit des cas géographiques, par exemple dans certains pays, on peut
and in some exceptional cases, there can be very deep recessions in limited geographical areas because of political events, wars, etc., or other exceptional cases, such as the COVID-19 crisis.
Sur le plan
from a microeconomic perspective,
avec la même chose, c'est-à-dire
we see the same phenomenon.
Nous avons la fameuse destruction.
We have the famous Schumpeter's famous creative destruction.
Je rappelle la destruction.
This creative destruction
le fait que un produit nouveau issu
comes from a new product,
va
an innovative product that will corner a market and render the previous products on that market obsolete.
Qui deviennent obsolètes vont devoir faire de
and so these obsolete products will have to be either retooled or will end up experiencing degrowth.
Une solution, on a un remède.
But there is a remedy.
Que justement, c'est la destruction créatrice elle-même. D'ailleurs,
I would say the creative destruction itself, but personally I prefer the term destructive creation rather than creative destruction.
C'est d'abord un nouveau produit.
Because in the end, it is a new product that leads to the obsolescence, the disappearance of an older product. And so you have people who will be laid off in companies experiencing degrowth, but these same people can be rehired in companies that are experiencing growth. So degrowth exists. It's like a minor flu, but that we know how we can live with it and we can treat it.
So this view of degrowth is being called into question when you start addressing the criticism which is addressed at targeted at growth. And with respect to criticizing growth, there are two types of criticism, which leads us to think that we might think about degrowth rather than considering growth is suffered, as that growth is to be perceived as a minor disease, minor flu, but the reverse could be considered, that is, that degrowth could be considered as a remedy. So the key points of argument in favor of degrowth with respect to general critique of growth, and I have in mind René Passet, who demonstrated in his book L'économique et le vivant, or the economics and the living, that the economic sphere is included into a larger sphere, which is biosphere, including all other natural environment and other components, and that if we are not capable of having relations, appropriate normal relations with our natural environment, then disaster will ensue, and we will get impoverished. And so in my introductory remark, I briefly touched upon green growth. As I mentioned earlier,
donc, la
green growth, in fact,
traduit, donc,
translates into, and apologies here, I wanted to cite someone here. The boundaries or the limits of green growth is the famous decoupling, which people speak about, which could be a solution. In fact, it does not exist, is no solution. And I want to cite what Jean Gadret said, who said that ever since the 1970s, the intensity of CO2 emissions in global GDP, that is the intensity index measuring emissions by GDP unit, decreased by some 40%. And since global GDP increased by more than a factor of 3 in volumes, CO2 emissions got increased by 1.9, by a factor of 1.9. This is Jean Gadret saying this in his book, saying goodbye to growth, which shows the limits to green growth. Now, these two components, or these two items, lead us to think that we should be talking about degrowth. Now, the narratives or the approach we can use about degrowth, and the approach to degrowth can involve a comprehensive, holistic approach, basically saying we need to degrow across the board, and there's lots of research and thinking on this aspect, including Serge Latouche, who is one of the best-known economists in France, working on degrowth. And Serge Latouche said, let us think about degrowth. Let us not be irrealistic, though. We need to make a clear choice and a clear distinction between degrowth, which will be affecting the rich countries, the well-off countries, and degrowth, which will be covering or affecting poor countries, because we need to have poor countries developing and becoming more advanced, and we need to have a different types of approach. And this type of approach is the one used in some agreements or environmental treaties, like the Montreal Agreement, which regulated CFCs with different provisions applying to developing countries. Now, in the Kyoto Agreement, the same went with the quota shares of greenhouse gas emissions. The rich countries are required to do more efforts than developing or poor countries. This is the holistic approach. And then there's another approach which can be followed, which I would call the managerial approach, and this would be about managerial or management degrowth. Now, we are speaking a lot about holistic or global approach, but with respect to management degrowth or managerial degrowth, there is some kind of omerta. No one is really talking about it, but it is of importance, because if we want to really seriously speak about degrowth, then you should mention economics. And speaking about economics, we need to focus on the cornerstone of the economic system, which basically are the businesses, the corporations. So we cannot, at some point, not ask ourselves the questions to know how businesses will respond to this approach. So this would be the second approach, that is on the on the side of businesses. How will businesses respond to a degrowth system, and how businesses can be helped to engage in degrowth, because degrowing in absolute terms for businesses amount to committing suicides, basically disappearing and closing shops. So it would be difficult for both employees and shareholders to be told, well, be environmentalist and be ecological and shut down your operations. So if we want to engage in management or managerial degrowth, we need to help businesses think through the concept. Now, the last thing I want to say with respect to these approaches to degrowth is that degrowth does not replace growth. Degrowth is not anti-growth. It stands, or it falls within a system which in many ways will remain focused on growth or will engage in growth, but degrowth is just one of the components which will try and meet the climate challenge ahead of us. And I would even go further. I would say that somehow degrowth basically supplements green growth. Why does it supplement green growth? Well, as we'll see, green growth generates in itself, if we push the limit of the green growth thinking, in fact, green growth generates degrowth. Now, what do we mean when I say green growth? In fact, there are three pillars to green growth. There is the end of programmed obsolescence, there is circular economy, and there's the so-called economy of functionality. Now, if we push the limit of this thinking process, when I told you that there are three components, these three components you find in the French law of 2015 on energy transition and green economics or green economy. And the law is not just called energy transition, there is green economy in this law. So what is the end of programmed obsolescence? Making sure that some goods having a 5-year lifetime will have a 10-year lifetime. If you push the logic to the limit, if you consider that the market is relatively saturated and and it is a question of renewing the goods with some innovation supporting it, well, at the end of a few years, what you'll have is no longer a need to produce 100 units, but you will need to produce 50% of these 100 because the lifetime will be multiplied by a factor of 2, which means that businesses engaged in programmed obsolescence, well, for some of them, will have to lay off and dismiss some employees, so generating degrowth. Now, economy of functionality, you have the same problem. With economy of functionality, it's a question of shifting from owning a good to leasing or renting a good. Basically, I'm being simplistic here, but basically you own a good which you rent out. Instead of having one individual using a good a few times in any given year, you'll have 4 or 5 individuals who will be using this same good at the end of the day. Here again, we'll need fewer products and will have degrowth in the manufacturing of this product under economy of functionality. Now, for circular economy, things are a tiny bit more complex, but you have the same end results, with circular economy being about trying to generate savings and efficiencies that can generate degrowth. So I have briefly sketched out the key points of argument and the key questions which are connected with degrowth and which may generate degrowth. Now, after dealing with degrowth, I want now to deal with the so-called degrowing accounting or degrowth accounting. Now, what is the purpose of this degrowth accounting? There are 2 goals, basically. As I've just said, degrowth will generate a number of issues for businesses. So if you ask businesses to come up with their own solutions by themselves, the result will not be appropriate. So you need to have the central state intervene. Now, how will the central state or the central government and businesses will cooperate in order to operate in a world with degrowth? Well, they will successfully do this by way of dialogue and conversation involving information. And so degrowth accounting or degrowing accounting, or anyway, accounting or accountancy to be used in a context of degrowth will be the instrument of conversation between the corporations and the state, for states, for example, to grant subsidies to businesses, among other examples. The second goal for this accounting will be to initiate the advent of degrowth, not as a disease, not as a flu, but as a remedy, involves having an economic view and even a political view, which will be extremely clear. So the state, in its side, will need special types of information, which is not available otherwise. Now, how will the governments go about doing this? Well, this information, the state or the administration or the government will look for this information in the private accounting systems provided by the corporations, but in national accounting, in the national accounts, the state will extract information to manage things, to conduct an appropriate economic policy, but again, to support the process, because implementing degrowth will generate a number of issues, and with some degree of violence in the context of ecological or environmental crisis, and how to manage such a crisis. Now, to explain what I mean when we speak about degrowing or degrowth accounting, let me take a few examples. With respect to private accounting, mainly the type of accounting developed and produced by the corporations, which is used by the state. I will mention the notion of the productivity ratio and ecological cash flow. So productivity ratio is more about financial control, and ecological cash flow is more about financial accounting. And in national accounting or national accounts, the questions we'll be asking ourselves will be connected with purchasing power and the possibility via the use of some special types of information, the possibility for the state to communicate on this notion of purchasing power, because let us not forget that degrowth potentially involves reduced purchasing power for private individuals. Now, let us first focus on the private degrowth type of accounting, and let us start with the productivity ratio or ratios. Now, as a brief reminder, the productivity ratio, which is the most used ratio, is the ratio of added value on workforce. This is a workforce productivity ratio or labor productivity ratio. It is an incomplete indicator, but the benefit of this ratio for financial analysts or for professionals who only have external information on a company, that is that information provided by the profit and loss account or the financial appendices or accounting appendices, it is very easy to find the added value and to get the headcount or the workforce in a company and to develop this ratio. But from an ecological standpoint, this ratio is not sufficient. The ratios we are interested in for ecological viewpoints are such ratios as labor on consumption of inputs or production on input consumption. These inputs being the raw materials and energy. Basically, you need to calculate the productivity level using energy and raw materials. And this is very much ecological, because if you need fewer raw materials and less energy to manufacture goods or products, this is a way to protect the planet. So this information is information which is very well known, internal information by financial controllers. Anyone familiar with cost accounting, when you do deviation calculations, you have deviation on the workforce, on the labor force, but you have the deviation on or variances on raw materials with price variances. So this is the type of analysis you do, and this is the type of calculation you do. Now, this internal information can be used externally, and this doesn't generate a problem to the company. So we can imagine having ratios which would be more ecologically relevant, which would give more information and more data on the environmental policy implemented by a company. But this is not enough to have degrowth. Now, let us try and identify what degrowth ratios or degrowth indicators would be. Let us go back to the famous three degrowth pillars: end of programmed obsolescence, functionality economy, and circular economy, which are the three pillars in degrowth, as I mentioned. So the end of programmed obsolescence would give us a ratio like lifetime of production over consumption of inputs, with functionality economy giving us a ratio which would be production multiplied by the utilization rate over consumption of inputs, and circular economy would give us a ratio that is production over consumption of inputs as revised. So production over revised consumption and input. So how to calculate the lifetime of a produced good? Well, it's about highlighting the fact that when you have a good which is produced, which has a 5-year lifetime, the product doesn't have the same ecological value and the so-called degrowing value versus a good which has been produced with a 10-year lifetime. So we need to come up with a system or mechanism to calculate the actual value. So in order to calculate this production value, you can imagine having companies assisted in the process by some piece of software, very much like when a company calculates its carbon footprint or carbon assessment, when a company wants to know what is the carbon cost of air transport or marine transport or train transport. The company will not calculate this every time. A piece of software will calculate this based on standards. Of course, standards are not perfect, but you can imagine that standards would be developed to run these calculations. Same thing for the functionality economy. It is sometimes difficult for the businesses producing the products. It is difficult for them to know what will be the utilization rate of the products which it manufactures. So here again, standards, pre-established standards can be used, with those standards being developed and established by outside organizations, very much like the environmental agencies in France develop standards for carbon accounting. So here it's a question of a denominator to be used, what denominator you use to expand the field of investigation. And this brings us to the consumption of the revised consumption of inputs. Now, whether you consume raw materials which are directly mined from the earth or extracted from the earth, or you have recycled materials as an input, depending on what type of energy you consume, then you will need to find, and I do not have the solution, but you will need to find mechanisms and systems making it possible to differentiate production utilizing recycled materials versus production utilizing non-recycled materials. So much for what can be said on so-called productivity and the approach which can be used about degrowth for productivity.
Maintenant, revenons au deuxième
So let's come back to the second point now.
Cette approche qui est une
I told you already this approach, which is rather management control. We can talk about cash flow, ecological cash flow. So in which context can we evoke an ecological cash flow?
En fait, on l'a vu tout à l'heure, les entreprises qui sont en décroissance vont être des entreprises qui vont se retrouver en faillite. Si ces entreprises, donc,
so if these companies are going down because they proceeded to outgrowth, degrowth, obviously these companies are not going to be happy about that. So in order for them to do so, because ecological bankrupt is imposed by a state in just decision. For instance, state forgets forbids such and such decision, we will have situations in which will resemble what we are experiencing today. Some activity sectors are very much struggling because they are forbidden of working. So on the same hand, we might have sectors which wouldn't be allowed to work because their activity would be very harmful for the environment. And for the company to accept this, it has to be a counterpart. So a counterpart can concern the staff and the capital owners. So here I'm still in the market, traditional market economy, and that's voluntary on my part. I don't expect to proceed to a revolution to be in line with degrowth concept. So I try to be pragmatic. So what we're going to do today is to compensate. So if we take compensation of capital owners. So how can we compensate them? So we can think, we can think about nationalizations, share holder, we can buy their shares and stocks. So we bought these stocks by proceeding to calculation based on a cash flow of a future benefit.
De la même manière, ici, il faudra en fait.
And these owners couldn't benefit from this benefits. So we will have to compensate for this ecological benefit which are avoided. So these calculations won't be based on future benefit, but on saving, on future savings. So this is for ecological cash flow.
Alors, à partir de ce cash flow.
So based on this ecological cash flow, we'll be able to dialogue and to make capital owners accept a few points. And here we can get inspired by nationalizations. And so let's talk about staff problems. So they're going to be jobless. They will get compensation, but it's not outstanding. And they will be in a situation which is going to be impairing, especially for capital owners. And so that's going to be the stowaway. And so the stowaway passenger is the one who doesn't pay anything. But in this case, it's going to be even worse than a classical case. So if a company goes down and has ecological bankruptcy, it's for the good of everybody, the good of the community, and everybody is going to be able to benefit from this environment, from a better environment.
Mais ces gens, tout le monde en profite.
Everybody is benefiting from that, but the only payers are the company based on their staff and their capital owner. the result of this is that in this case, we may say that everybody is benefiting from that. So there are a lot of stowaway passengers, but those who paid the ticket to travel, so those who progressed in terms of environmental protection. So this people won't have the privilege to reach their destination because they're going to be jobless as for employees. So what could be the solution for employees? We could consider that jobless employees for ecological reasons should have a different processing than a traditional unemployed person. So in order to launch a reflection, we may not get inspired this time by nationalizations, but by privatizations. And we may think about the French case of privatization occurring in 1986.
Dans les entreprises nationalisées.
Employees who were in nationalized companies, the fact that they turned private had a few potential risks. The following risk was that they were more at risk with losing their jobs than in a private company. So in order for them to accept privatization, so in order for employees of national companies to accept privatization, we offered them to buy stocks of the capital of their company who just underwent privatization, and they could buy these stocks at very good conditions. So for these employees buying these stocks, there was the possibility a few years after to achieve added value, which was not to be neglected. And that was to compensate the potential risk, and in an ecological framework, it will be for a real risk. And so that's how we can think about a different approach based on a financial accountability of management of this ecological bankruptcies. So those are two examples of reflection I just mentioned, and on what could be decreasing private accounting in a way that outgrows, and that it wouldn't be a matter of random. So let's move on to national accountability. So in order to understand the stakes of national accounting, we're going to see what happens as for green economy. I always come back to that. Beforehand, I explained that it could result in outgrowths or degrowths. You could tell me, okay, that's punctually, but on the whole, doesn't have very positive effects. Don't we see everywhere that green jobs are going to be on the increase, and they're going to increase work on the whole. So we say about 800,000 jobs. So the threshold between the ratio between created jobs and lost jobs is going to be positive, 800,000 work, and as for the world level, we talk about millions of jobs which are going to be created. And here I come back to a study conducted by the Sirene Lab, on the request of the Megamet Association. So on this table, this is up to 2030, we have a net effect on jobs, which is
de
632,000 jobs. So we have sectors in a very high level of job creations, so renewable energy, building renovation, public transport. So we expect that more sectors which are going to be more logical, and other sectors which are going to decline with more renewable energy. We will have less carbon-based energy. And so the result of pluses and minuses is 632 net jobs. So why is this ratio positive between increasing sectors and declining sectors? So the number of created jobs for the same amount of money. Here, the calculation basis was 1 million euros, so the number of created jobs is not the same. So you see that, in fact, in increasing sectors, the number of jobs is higher, between 16 and 12.5, so more important than in decreasing companies, because we're going to go down to 2.5. So this justifies the fact that we have an increase in the number of jobs. But one has to see that created jobs, when we create 16 jobs with 1 million euros, and on the other hand we have 4 jobs created with 1 million euro, it's compensation is going to be less with 16 for 1 million euro, then 4 jobs for 1 million euro. Here I come back to Dar's report, and we can see that carbon-based sectors, production of electricity, current electricity and gas production, the average monthly salary is 4,300 euros. In more ecological sectors, the salary is only 2,879 euros. So we create jobs by reducing workers' salaries. So that's going to be quite hard to explain to people who underwent ecological bankruptcy. You contributed to the well-being of everybody. So now you are jobless, and you're going to train in order to earn less. So it's quite difficult to convey this kind of message. Doesn't mean we won't have to do that, but the state will have a high problem of communication in the context of degrowth, communication of purchase power. Purchase power is what we can buy with one's salary. But when we want to communicate on purchasing power, we have to think what it means. So I don't expect to have a total reply to the questions I raised here by showing this example showing decreasing salaries, but just want to remind us of something about programmed obsolescence. So when you buy a product with a life cycle of 10 years instead of 5 years, your purchase power is increasing because you're saving money. That's the argument of green ecology tenant.
redépenser ailleurs et on va relancer l'économie.
The money saved is going to spend somewhere else, and therefore it's going to reboost the economy. One has to be aware that in order to create growth, we create systematically energy consumption and carbon emissions and raw material consumption. So, in any case, if we consider a problem of planet finitude, we can't have this type of reasoning, and that's the difference with green ecology. We have some limits, and that's limits imposed by our planet. It's not infinite. We can't have infinite growth in a finite world. So, what could the state use in order to better communicate? As for degrowth. So, let's say,
une entreprise, vous avez donc une entreprise, un secteur.
We have a company, a sector, with sales accounting to 500,000 euros, with operational cost made very simple. Figures that don't matter here. So it's just for you to understand the principle. So in the context of programmed obsolescence, product life cycles are going to be multiplied by 2. So at the end of the year, the operating account with sales of 500 will turn into an account with sales of 250,000. You will have a different cost as well, and so I've been simplifying very much because I divided by 2 all the costs. I'm well aware that in real life it won't be like that because of the difference between the variable cost and the fixed cost. But let's say you have an activity dropping to 250,000 in terms of sales. So in fact, the company has to lay off people and doesn't benefit at the end of the day from. It doesn't benefit from.
D'avantages particuliers, au contraire.
Specific benefits, quite the opposite. So, the company is going to be losing. So in order to gain compensation from the state for its contribution to general interest, because everybody is going to enjoy this ecological bankruptcies or ecological activity reduction, it has to give information, and the information it could have will be either off account, external account presentation,
le chiffre d'affaires,
saying first that for ecological reasons turnover switched from 500,000 to so let's say 500 million euros, so from 500 to 250 on the one hand, and on the other hand, it has to indicate that the added value has been decreased by 165. So this presentation can be slightly different. We can have another presentation. So let's say after 5 years, when we have switched from 500 to 250, we could have a presentation of a private accounting with 165 credit, ecological credit, and with an environmental credit of 165. So we don't change the presentation; we just add something. You see, it's not very normal compared to what we're doing at the moment, but that's true. But in the 80s or 90s, we had a company called Migros, or PSO Origin, So the first one was a cooperative of food product distribution, and the other one was an IT company, and they presented what they were calling at the time negative added value. It was the fact that when we calculate our activity, we forget the destruction of natural heritage. And we tried to calculate the amount of destruction of natural heritage, and it was deducted from the financial results. So, instead of having environmental gain, we had a loss, environmental loss, because it was a negative added value. But all that to say that in terms of presentation, it doesn't raise problems, any problems. So that's what can happen in private companies disclosing the information necessary to dialogue with the state.
When it
comes to national accounting, if you look at the use and resource table, which is relatively simple, national production plus imports equals consumption minus exports comes to the end result. Now, how is this going to... How is this equation going to finish? Imagine 4 different situations. I'm sorry, I'm looking for my papers. And I didn't learn all of the figures by heart.
Voilà. Donc, nous avons
so we have 4 potential situations. The first one,
l'équilibre de la fameuse équation va se
the very balanced 100,000 in national production plus 20,000 in imports, 90,000 in end consumption, exports 20,000.
d'investissement.
And so in the end, GFCF investments, 10,000.
Donc maintenant qu'on a notre fameux secteur, nos fameuses qui ont fait de la fin de l'obsolescence.
Take a company that has eliminated planned obsolescence.
Le chiffre d'affaires était passé de
and where sales have gone from 500 to 250. And the GFCF also 250. In national accounting, this is the
le chiffre d'affaires c'est 250 et la valeur ajoutée c'est 165, mais il faut pas oublier que
keep in mind with all of these figures that there are also intermediate steps and intermediate consumption that have added value. So there is a change in added value throughout these equations.
Une activité qui est une activité, par
exemple, let's look at
purement nationale.
A completely domestic business.
À la fin de l'obsolescence programmée, sont des
at the end of planned obsolescence, these domestic companies will have
au lieu d'être 200 000, n'est plus que 99 000.
Will be in the following situation. End consumption will be 89,750.
Donc, on a une consommation finale également qui est diminuée de 250. Comment pourrait-on
Now, how can we highlight this specific information by adding 250 to national production and adding 250 as well to GFCF investments? Why in the investments?
La nouveauté, c'est que à côté de la formation,
because when it comes to the gross fixed capital formation, there will be a third item to create.
La comptabilité.
Let me explain.
Nationale.
Today,
donc, considère
national
fait des calculs, finalement, les calculs
accounting
et des calculs de flux, plus que de stock. Et la seule chose,
calculates flows rather than inventories.
En quelque sorte, au niveau stock, pourrait-on dire, c'est la formation brute.
And it's the GFCF that recognizes inventories more. Now, the gross fixed capital formation is tangible or intangible assets arising from production and that have an influence on other aspects of production for 1 year.
Elle est claire.
This is a relatively clear definition.
De facto, elle exclut finalement de facto, les effets de la fin de l'obsolescence.
It makes it impossible to recognize elimination of planned obsolescence.
Comme je disais, la particularité, donc, c'est qu'en comptabilité nationale,
national accounting,
on tient compte avant tout de
the focus today is on flows, but there's perhaps a notion of inventory with the gross fixed capital formation. The disadvantage of this sort of
de l'obsolescence programmée revient finalement.
The disadvantage is in planned obsolescence, which
une durée longue n'apparaît absolument pas en comptabilité.
Is that this notion of planned obsolescence does not appear in national accounting. Because anything that's not incorporated into the production process is not explicitly recognized. So we'd have to have a third path between national production and GFCF. So how could we present this? Now, if we had this third aspect, we have an initial situation, national production, imports and consumption, exports, and GFCF, plus this potential third aspect. To see how this could be done, in the first situation, you have national production that went down by 250.
Donc, ce qu'il faudrait faire, c'est mettre dans une case un peu spéciale les 50 potentiels finalement de production
add the potential GFCF in another place, because in the end, there's a longer potential inventory, a longer pipeline, if you will. So we would put these 250 in the third aspect box.
Tout ce qui concourt à la production de ces biens-là n'est pas national.
Now, at the same time, everything that contributes to producing this product might not be sourced domestically. So in this case, if we look at situation 2, national production goes down by only 220, imports by 30, so we're here at 250 in total, and then 30 for end consumption and 220 for GFCF, and this third aspect.
Que donc la production de 500,
let's see that the 500 of production is completely outsourced. In situation 4, we have
mais qui est accompagné de la fin de l'obsolescence.
This 500 that is completely outsourced, but that has an effect on unplanned obsolescence as well. Now, naturally, this presentation is extremely simplistic.
Bon, en comptabilité privée pure,
and for private accounting, I'm happy to assert my positions, but here in national accounting, I'm not necessarily a specialist, and so what I did here was, I opened the data up a little bit. I'm sure this could be criticized, and perhaps rightly so.
Aux problèmes d'environnement, je pense notamment, par exemple, à la mise en place du concept d'épargne nette ajustée.
I'm thinking also of the interest of future ecology, and so I think of concepts such as adjusted national savings.
Calcul où vous avez production moins consommation.
In this case,
variation du capital humain, moins diminution des stocks énergétiques minerais forêts, moins coût de CO2 émis.
In this case, you can
dire autre chose que de dire que
add also you'd have to add ecological aspects, for example, CO2 emissions avoided.
Cette présentation. Alors, je vais en arriver à la conclusion. Alors,
come to the conclusion.
Donc, je voudrais insister sur
quatre points. Insist on 4 points.
Le premier, on reproche souvent aux gens qui font de la décroissance d'être des nantis.
Often we hear that degrowth is great for the rich.
Les minima sociaux ou le SMIC.
But if you were earning minimum wage, you would probably not be a fan of degrowth, and even more so if you're living in a part of the world that suffers from hunger. But I would like to specify one thing. If we don't talk about degrowth, then degrowth will happen anyway through an ecological disaster.
Un exemple, bon, on sait par exemple que...
for example, we know that today sea levels are rising.
Cela va se traduire, on a déjà fait un peu les évolutions au niveau de l'évolution climatique.
And we've done a lot of calculations.
250 millions de réfugiés climatiques qui vont arriver.
And there are 200 to 250 million climate refugees that are going to arrive. So we have this concept of yield. We've realized that in cases like islands or even in southern France, rising sea levels can create unexpected effects. For example, the salt content in the surrounding lands increases, which makes it this land less arable. Now, if we don't do anything, then at some point degrowth will arrive. So best to manage this degrowth rather than simply have it imposed. The second thing,
cette décroissance,
I've been talking about degrowth from an accounting perspective, but it can be seen from a much broader perspective, political, economical, and especially a monetary policy.
Par exemple, sur les fameux taux d'intérêt négatifs.
So we could think about negative interest rates. We're all worried about them today. It's the gateway to risky investments, etc. But we only see that from a negative perspective. I would be tempted to say that, yes, these risks exist, but it's a very interesting experiment, because in the case of degrowth, we would have global growth of 0 or slightly under 0. We'd have to see interest rates the same way. Zero interest rates or even negative interest rates would be logical. So we have to be more open-minded.
Elle est très difficile à
But granted, it's hard to implement this vigilance from a social and political perspective. Earlier, I talked about similarities with the health crisis. I wanted to point out these similarities, and it's important because when you look at what's happening today, we can find it gives us insight into how we could manage a severe climate crisis. First of all, commerce has to continue. And goods have to change hands. And in France, GDP has gone down 8-9%, if it's not 15-16%. So there will have to be transfers of wealth. So people have to be able to purchase, they have to be able to consume. Secondly, we mustn't hesitate to practice unorthodox or diverse finance. Including differences between the public and private sector. We've been talking a lot about the small, little jobs that perhaps deserve higher compensation. We saw this, and we've seen some progress in the area, especially when it comes to the health sector. So this wage hierarchy could also be examined from an ecological standpoint.
Les gens qui ont des salaires liés à des activités extrêmement préjudiciables à l'environnement,
people whose work is disastrous for the environment perhaps should have lower wages.
Les secteurs qui sont touchés, actuellement, on voit bien.
The sectors that are affected seem to be random, very unfair. In some in some sectors, it's very hard for people not to be able to work. We'll see the same feelings, the same phenomenon when it comes to degrowth. Today, the financial markets are not really helping to solve the crisis. They're basically seeing how to maximize their profits regardless of the context. So we will not be able to count on the financial markets for help. Today, there are behavioral constraints and social restrictions and reactions. Now, these behavioral constraints won't be the same, of course, but we might, we'll see, for example, a reduction in travel, that you won't be able to fly around the world every day. The role of government is another major subject. We're talking about it a lot today. And really, every time we talk about degrowth, the government will have to intervene, will have to manage this process. There will also be effects on globalization. Today we're talking about relocalization of certain activity. And in the context of a climate or an ecological crisis,
une réduction des émissions demandée aussi.
It would also be possible to relocalize activities for environmental reasons.
Ça, c'est un autre
for example, to reduce shipping. So there are some similarities between these two crises. And so this experience, in the end, will help us to manage degrowth.
Là, il y a un petit souci.
little problem here. Bernard,
c'est la fin.
Yeah, I'm afraid we're out of time. Okay, so let me conclude there. I didn't want to keep you from giving your conclusion. Then let me just say very simply that degrowth is an up-and-coming idea, and we'll stop there.